Tonight, we drift back to a time before written memory, before human history truly begins, guided only by the oldest words ever pressed into clay. Imagine yourself standing at the threshold of a temple archive in ancient Sumer, somewhere in the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where the air hangs thick with the scent of burning cedar and the faint mineral tang of river mud drying in the relentless Mesopotamian sun. The year, if we could even call it that, stretches so far backward that our modern calendars simply shrug their shoulders and give up, because we are not merely visiting the 3rd or 4th millennium before the Common Era, but reaching toward a mythic epoch that the Sumerians themselves regarded as incomprehensibly ancient, a time when gods walked the earth, and kings reigned for periods that would make Methuselah look like he barely made it past his morning coffee. The temple around you rises in stepped tiers, a ziggurat of mud brick and ambition, its walls adorned with lapis lazuli and carnelian, that catch the flickering oil lamps like frozen starlight, and somewhere deep within these sacred halls, scribes are pressing their reed styluses into soft clay tablets, recording stories that will outlast empires, religions, and the very concept of nations as we understand them. These are the Sumerian king lists, among the most extraordinary documents ever recovered from the ancient world, cataloging rulers whose reigns supposedly spanned tens of thousands of years each, as if time itself operated under different management in those distant days. And I should warn you now that if you are hoping for neat, sensible explanations wrapped in a bow tonight, you probably won't survive this, because the Sumerians were not terribly concerned with making their cosmology convenient for skeptical modern listeners trying to fall asleep. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, because algorithmic validation aside, I would much rather have a small gathering of genuinely curious insomniacs than a vast assembly of people who clicked by accident while searching for videos about cats playing piano. Though I suppose if you found ancient Mesopotamian chronology while looking for cats, you might be exactly the kind of delightfully confused wanderer who belongs with us anyway. If you feel like sharing where you are listening from and what time it is there, go ahead and drop that in the comments, because there is something rather magical about knowing that these ancient stories are reaching ears in Tokyo at 3 in the morning, in São Paulo just before midnight, in a cozy apartment in Oslo, where the winter darkness makes 5 o'clock feel like the middle of the night, all of us connected across impossible distances by words first spoken 5,000 years ago in a language that has no living native speakers. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, because the story we are exploring requires a certain softness of mind, a willingness to let the boundaries between history and mythology grow pleasantly blurry, like the edges of a dream just before you slip fully into sleep. The Sumerian king list, our primary guide through these waters tonight, exists in multiple fragmentary copies discovered across various archaeological sites, the most famous being the Weld-Blundell prism, a small clay prism about 8 inches tall covered in cuneiform script, currently residing in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, where it sits behind glass, looking remarkably unassuming for something that casually claims kingship descended from heaven before the flood, and lists 8 rulers who together reigned for nearly 250,000 years, which is either the most audacious record-keeping error in human history, or evidence of something so strange that mainstream archaeology prefers to file it under mythology and move along to less uncomfortable topics. The mainstream historical fact we should acknowledge here is that the Sumerian king list was likely compiled during the reign of King Utu-Hagel of Uruk around 2100 BCE as a political document meant to legitimize his dynasty by connecting it to an unbroken chain of divine authority stretching back to the very dawn of creation, essentially the ancient equivalent of claiming your grandfather knew George Washington, except your grandfather allegedly knew the gods who created humanity, which is admittedly a more impressive pedigree, but also significantly harder to verify on Ancestry.com. Scholars like Thorkild Jacobsen, who produced the definitive translation of the king list in 1939, approached these antediluvian reigns with sensible caution, interpreting the impossibly long numbers as either symbolic representations of dynasties rather than individuals, or as artifacts of a numerical system we do not fully understand, or perhaps as deliberate mythological padding designed to make the historical kings who followed seem more impressive by comparison. The way a comedian will often open for a bigger act, by being just mediocre enough to make the headliner look brilliant. But here is where things get interesting, because alongside these respectable scholarly interpretations exists a whole tradition of fringe theories that take these numbers at face value and ask what could possibly explain them, with suggestions ranging from different orbital periods of the Earth in ancient times, which physics would like a word about, to the idea that these kings were not human at all, but rather members of an advanced extraterrestrial civilization whose lifespans operated on an entirely different biological clock, a theory most famously popularized by Zecharia Sitchin in his Earth Chronicles series, where he argued that the Anunnaki mentioned in Sumerian texts were actually beings from a planet called Nibiru, who visited Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago and genetically engineered humanity to serve as a labor force, which sounds absolutely bonkers until you realize that the Sumerians themselves described their gods in remarkably physical terms, eating, drinking, quarreling, and having children in ways that seem oddly corporeal for purely spiritual beings. Now, I am not suggesting you believe the ancient astronaut theory. I am barely suggesting I believe anything at all at this hour. But there is something delicious about the fact that our earliest written records are so strange, so resistant to easy explanation, that they have spawned interpretive traditions ranging from sober Assyriology to the kind of speculation you find in late-night documentaries, narrated by men with very dramatic voices and questionable haircuts. The ongoing scholarly debate worth mentioning here centers on whether the antediluvian section of the king list represents genuine oral tradition passed down from prehistoric times, perhaps containing distorted memories of real early settlements and their leaders, or whether it was entirely invented by later scribes who needed to establish cosmic authority for their contemporary rulers, and simply made up impressive-sounding numbers because, frankly, who was going to fact-check them? The gods. Historian Piotr Steinkeller of Harvard has argued that the list preserves genuine historical memory from the 4th millennium BCE, while others like Amélie Court contend that the entire antediluvian section should be treated as purely mythological, a creation narrative dressed in the garb of administrative record-keeping, and honestly, both positions have merit, which is the frustrating thing about studying civilizations that left no footnotes explaining when they were being literal and when they were being poetic. As you settle deeper into your pillow, let the oil lamps flicker in your imagination, casting dancing shadows on the mud brick walls of that ancient temple archive, and consider that somewhere in the city of Eridu, the oldest city in the world, according to Sumerian tradition, predating even Uruk and Ur, a scribe is carefully pressing his stylus into wet clay, recording that the first king after kingship descended from heaven was Alulim, who ruled for 28,800 years, which is either a scribal error, a symbolic number representing cosmic cycles, evidence of alien life expectancy, or the most impressive case of good genetics in universal history. And the beautiful truth is that we genuinely do not know which interpretation is correct. We may never know, and that uncertainty is not a failure of scholarship, but rather an invitation to wonder, to let the mystery remain unresolved as your breathing slows and the numbers begin to blur into comfortable abstraction. The temple air is cooling now, as evening falls over ancient Sumer, the date palms rustling in the breeze that comes off the marshlands, and somewhere a priest is chanting hymns to Enlil, Lord of the Air, while scribes yawn over their tablets and temple cats. Yes, they had cats. Humans have always had cats. This is non-negotiable. Patrol the grain stores for mice who lack proper reverence for sacred spaces, and if you find yourself smiling at the image of ancient Sumerian cats doing exactly what modern cats do, namely whatever they want with complete disregard for human authority, then you are already in the right frame of mind for this journey. Relaxed and amused and willing to let history wash over you like warm water. The antediluvian kings of the Sumerian king list occupy a strange territory between myth and memory, rulers whose names have survived for 5,000 years, but whose reigns stretch into durations so vast that they seem to mock the very concept of human lifespan. And as we settle deeper into this story, imagining the cool mud brick walls of temple archives and the gentle scratch of reed styluses on clay, we encounter names like Alulim of Eridu, who ruled for 28,800 years, and Alalgar, who followed him with another 36,000 years on the throne, and then Enmenlu Ana of Bad Tabira, who apparently decided that modest tenure was for amateurs and reigned for a casual 43,200 years, which means that if he had started his rule when mammoths still roamed Europe, he would still have had time to catch the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza before his mid-reign crisis. These numbers are, to put it mildly, problematic for anyone trying to construct a sensible timeline, and yet they were recorded with the same matter-of-fact administrative tone that the scribes used for more plausible historical data, as if there were nothing unusual about a king whose reign exceeded the entire span of recorded human civilization by a factor of 4, and this casual attitude toward impossibility is either evidence of profound symbolic thinking or proof that ancient scribes had a sense of humor we have entirely failed to appreciate. The mainstream scholarly interpretation, which we should acknowledge before venturing into stranger waters, is that these enormous reign lengths may represent something other than individual lifespans. Perhaps they encode astronomical cycles, with the numbers corresponding to observations of planetary movements that the Sumerians tracked with remarkable precision. Or perhaps they represent dynastic periods during which multiple kings ruled under a single throne name, the way a papal name might be shared across centuries. Or perhaps they employ a numerical system with a different base than our decimal counting, making the numbers appear larger than intended, though no one has convincingly cracked this code despite over a century of trying. The city of Bad Tabira, where several of these antediluvian monarchs supposedly ruled, has been identified with a site about 12 miles south of modern Bismaya in Iraq, and excavations have revealed occupation layers stretching back to around 5000 BCE, which is impressively ancient, but still falls somewhat short of the hundreds of thousands of years the king list seems to require, unless of course we are meant to understand these dates as mythological rather than historical, in which case the archaeological evidence is beside the point, and we should simply accept that Bad Tabira existed in mythic time, that peculiar zone where normal physics take a holiday and gods can casually drop in for dinner. The quirky interpretation I want to share with you now comes from the fringes of ancient astronaut theory, where researchers like Zecharia Sitchin and his intellectual descendants have proposed that the long reigns make perfect sense if we understand the Sumerian Sar, a unit of time equal to 600 years, as representing one orbit of the hypothetical planet Nibiru around the Sun, meaning that a reign of 10 Sars would be 36,000 Earth years, but only 10 years by Nibiru's calendar, which would explain why the Anunnaki gods seemed immortal to humans while actually aging at a normal rate relative to their own planetary cycles. And I want to be very clear that this theory requires accepting premises that mainstream astronomy firmly rejects, including the existence of a massive undiscovered planet in our solar system, whose orbital period vastly exceeds anything we have observed. But there is something almost charming about the creative accounting involved, the earnest attempt to make ancient mythology compatible with modern science fiction. And at this hour of the night, with sleep tugging at the edges of your consciousness, I suspect you are less interested in rigorous fact-checking than in the pleasant sensation of ideas washing over you, like warm waves. The scholarly debate surrounding these kings intensified in the 20th century, when Samuel Noah Kramer, the great Sumerologist, who did more than perhaps anyone to make these ancient texts accessible to English readers, argued that the antediluvian section of the king list preserved genuine folk memory of pre-flood settlements, distorted by generations of oral transmission, but containing a kernel of historical truth, while his contemporary W.G. Lambert took a more skeptical view, suggesting that the entire antediluvian framework was a later invention designed to provide cosmic justification for the political arrangements of the Ur-III dynasty, essentially ancient propaganda, dressed up as primordial history. What makes this debate fascinating is that both interpretations have implications for how we understand early human culture. If Kramer is right, then oral tradition can preserve information across truly staggering spans of time, potentially giving us access to memories of events that occurred during the Neolithic or even earlier, while if Lambert is right, then we learn something equally interesting about how ancient peoples constructed authority and legitimacy through creative manipulation of mythological narratives, which is honestly not that different from how modern political campaigns operate, just with more cuneiform and fewer attack ads. The fifth antediluvian king was Dumuzi, a shepherd who ruled in Bad Tabira for 28,800 years. And this name should sound familiar if you have any background in ancient mythology, because Dumuzi later became a central figure in Sumerian religious literature, the husband of the goddess Inanna, who was dragged to the underworld as her substitute after she escaped from the land of the dead, a story that prefigures later dying and rising god narratives found in cultures throughout the ancient Mediterranean. And the fact that a mythological figure of such importance appears as an ordinary entry in an administrative king list suggests either that the boundaries between history and mythology were far more permeable in Sumerian thought than in our own, or that the scribes were working from genuinely ancient sources that predated the later mythological elaborations, or possibly that they simply included every significant name they could remember without worrying too much about categorical consistency, which is honestly the approach I take to most things in life. After Dumuzi came Ensipa-Zidana, who ruled in the city of Larak for 28,800 years, maintaining that curiously consistent number that appears again and again in the antediluvian section, like a rhythmic refrain, and then Enmendur-Ana of Sipar, who reigned for 21,000 years, and who is particularly interesting because later Babylonian tradition identified him with the figure of the seventh antediluvian patriarch in Hebrew tradition, the one who walked with God and was taken up to heaven without dying, suggesting deep connections between Mesopotamian and biblical mythology that scholars have traced with increasing precision over the past century and a half, demonstrating that the Great Flood narrative in Genesis has roots extending back to Sumerian literature thousands of years earlier, which does not make either tradition more or less true, but certainly makes both traditions more interesting. The seventh king was Ubaratutu, who ruled in Shuruppak for 18,600 years, and Shuruppak is significant because it was the city where the Sumerian flood hero lived, called Ziusudra in the earliest versions, Utnapishtim in the later Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, and Noah in the Hebrew Bible, meaning that the very last antediluvian city was the one from which the flood survivor emerged, a narrative convenience that suggests either historical memory of a real catastrophic flood in Mesopotamia or skilled storytelling by scribes who understood how to structure a tale for maximum impact. The eighth and final antediluvian king presents a textual problem because some versions of the king list give only Ubaratutu, while others include his son Ziusudra, and the discrepancy has generated considerable scholarly discussion about textual transmission and the reliability of our reconstructions, which is exactly the kind of detail that matters enormously to specialists and almost not at all to someone trying to drift off to sleep. So I will simply note that ancient manuscripts are messy, scribes made errors, and editorial choices, and we are lucky to have any of this material at all, given the fragility of clay and the passage of 5,000 years. As your eyelids grow heavier and the world outside your window fades to comfortable darkness, imagine the last night before the Great Flood, the priests of Shuruppak looking anxiously at storm clouds gathering on the horizon, the king perhaps performing final rituals while somewhere a wise man, Ziusudra, Utnapishtim, whatever name you prefer, is receiving divine warning to build a boat and gather the seeds of all living things. And the parallel to later flood narratives is so striking that even the most skeptical scholars acknowledge some kind of historical connection, whether through direct cultural transmission or shared memory of actual catastrophic flooding in the low-lying Mesopotamian plains, where periodic inundations were a regular feature of life, making flood mythology practically inevitable for any civilization that chose to build in the muddy territory between two great rivers. The antediluvian age ends with the waters rising, cities vanishing beneath waves that would become the most famous flood in human storytelling, and when the waters recede, kingship will descend from heaven a second time, now to historically plausible rulers whose reigns are measured in decades rather than millennia, and the transition from mythic to historical time will begin, though the boundary between them will remain forever blurred. The Anunnaki descend from the heavens, and whether they are gods, aliens, or symbolic representations of natural forces depends very much on which books you have been reading and how late at night you started reading them, but the Sumerians themselves were quite clear that these beings came from above, from the sky, from the cosmic realm called On, where the supreme god Anu held court, and their arrival on Earth marked the beginning of civilization itself, the moment when humans emerged from animal existence into the structured world of agriculture, cities, law, and bureaucracy, which is either a great gift or a terrible burden depending on how you feel about paperwork. The name Anunnaki appears in Sumerian texts with various spellings and interpretations, most commonly understood to mean those of princely seed or offspring of Anu, referring to the children and descendants of the sky god, who were assigned various cosmic and earthly duties by the divine assembly, and these beings were not distant abstractions, but active participants in human affairs, visiting temples, receiving offerings, making decisions that affected crop yields and military victories, and the fates of individual human beings, which made religious observance not merely a matter of spiritual devotion, but of practical survival, like maintaining good relations with a particularly powerful and temperamental landlord who happened to control the weather. The mainstream historical understanding of the Anunnaki presents them as personifications of cosmic and natural forces, the kind of divine beings that every agricultural civilization seems to develop, entities that explain why rivers flood, why crops grow, why some years bring abundance and others bring famine. And the Sumerian system was more elaborate than most, with a divine hierarchy that mirrored human political structures, an assembly of gods that debated and voted on decisions affecting the cosmos, and a bureaucracy of lesser deities who carried out administrative functions because apparently even divinity requires middle management. Among the most important Anunnaki were Enlil, lord of the air, and effective king of the gods during most of Sumerian history, Enki, god of fresh water, wisdom, and crafts, who was humanity's greatest advocate in the divine council, and Inanna, goddess of love, war, and the planet Venus, who appears in more surviving literature than any other Sumerian deity, and whose stories range from triumphant conquest to heartbreaking loss, providing a remarkably complex portrait of divine character that resists simple categorization. The quirky interpretation of the Anunnaki that has captured public imagination since the 1970s comes from the work of Zecharia Sitchin, who claimed to have found in these ancient texts evidence of an extraterrestrial visitation, arguing that the Anunnaki were flesh and blood beings from the planet Nibiru, who came to Earth approximately 450,000 years ago in search of gold, which they needed to repair their planet's atmosphere, and who genetically engineered Homo sapiens by mixing their DNA with that of Homo erectus to create a worker species capable of mining the precious metal, a theory that explains human uniqueness, the sudden appearance of civilization, and the persistent mythological theme of gods creating humans for service, though it requires accepting a series of premises that mainstream science regards as entirely unsupported, including the existence of Nibiru, the possibility of interplanetary travel in the deep past, and a translation methodology that professional Assyriologists have repeatedly criticized as creative at best and fabricated at worst. Now, I am not here to tell you what to believe. I am here to help you fall asleep while thinking interesting thoughts, but I will note that the line between ancient astronaut theory and mainstream archaeology is not quite as clear as either side sometimes pretends, because the Sumerians really did describe their gods in remarkably physical terms, really did claim that kingship descended from heaven, really did build their entire civilization around the premise that non-human beings had given them the arts of civilization, and the question of what exactly they meant by all this remains genuinely open, with respectable scholars offering interpretations that range from pure symbolism to dim memories of earlier cultures whose achievements seemed godlike to later generations. The scholarly debate I want to highlight here concerns the relationship between the Anunnaki and the Igigi, another group of divine beings mentioned in Mesopotamian texts, with some scholars arguing that the Igigi were originally distinct deities who were later merged into the Anunnaki category, while others suggest that Igigi referred specifically to the celestial gods, while Anunnaki referred to the chthonic deities of the underworld, and still others propose that the distinction was primarily one of status, with Anunnaki representing the senior gods and Igigi the junior ones who performed labor on their behalf until they rebelled and demanded the creation of humans to take over the work, a narrative preserved in the Babylonian creation epic Enuma Elish and the Atrahasis myth that provides yet another origin story for humanity as a replacement workforce for exhausted divine laborers. The creation of humans according to these texts involved the sacrifice of a rebellious god, whose blood was mixed with clay by the mother goddess Ninhursag, working under the direction of the clever god Enki, to produce 7 male and 7 female prototypes who would serve the gods by working the fields, digging the canals, and building the temples, essentially cosmic interns whose job was to make the gods' lives easier, which is a rather unflattering origin story when you think about it, but also oddly reassuring, because it suggests that the fundamental human experience of working too hard, while those above you relax, has been recognized as the natural order since the very beginning of recorded thought. The Anunnaki's role in establishing civilization extended beyond mere creation to active instruction, with texts describing how individual gods taught specific arts to humanity. Enki gave the Mi, those divine decrees that governed all aspects of civilized life, to the city of Eridu, and later to Inanna for Uruk, while other deities taught agriculture, brewing, weaving, writing, and the countless other skills that distinguish human society from animal existence. And there is something touching about the idea that the gods cared enough to educate their creations, rather than simply exploiting them, even if that education was ultimately designed to produce better workers. The physical descriptions of Anunnaki in Sumerian art show them as human-like but larger, often depicted with distinctive horned headdresses that mark their divine status, and scenes of divine council meetings show them seated on thrones debating the fates of humans and the cosmos, with all the gravity and occasional pettiness of any parliamentary body, complete with faction disputes, personal grudges, and compromise solutions that satisfy no one entirely, but keep the cosmic machinery functioning, which is honestly rather comforting, because it suggests that dysfunction and compromise are not failures of human political organization, but features of existence built into the very structure of the universe. As the night deepens, and your thoughts grow soft around the edges, imagine the Anunnaki descending to ancient Eridu, the first city, where the great temple of Enki rises from the marshlands, its foundation planted in the Abzu, the freshwater abyss that lies beneath the earth, and provides the life-giving waters that make agriculture possible in this otherwise harsh landscape. And picture the god himself emerging from the waters, scales glinting in the torchlight, serpentine and wise, bearing the gifts of civilization that will transform wandering humans into city dwellers, farmers, scribes and dreamers, for better or worse bound to the cycles of planting and harvest, taxation and tribute, that will define human existence for the next 10,000 years and counting. The descent from heaven that begins the Sumerian king list refers to this moment, when divine beings first established organized society on earth, and whether you understand this as metaphor for the development of human culture, as dim memory of contact with an earlier advanced civilization, or as genuine divine intervention depends on frameworks of belief that lie well beyond what we can determine from the texts themselves, which remain stubbornly ambiguous despite 5,000 years of interpretation, and perhaps that ambiguity is itself part of their function. Stories designed not to close down meaning, but to open it up, to invite generation after generation of listeners to find their own answers in the ancient words. Interpreting the impossible ages recorded in the Sumerian king list has occupied scholars, mystics, and enthusiastic amateurs for well over a century now, and as we settle into the fourth part of our journey, surrounded by the comfortable darkness and the soft hum of whatever background noise you have chosen to accompany your drift toward sleep, we should acknowledge that the range of explanations offered for these bewildering numbers spans the entire spectrum, from rigorously academic to delightfully unhinged, with valuable insights scattered somewhat unpredictably across the whole distribution. The mainstream scholarly approach, which we should establish as our baseline before venturing into stranger territory, holds that the enormous reign lengths in the antediluvian section of the king list were never meant to be taken as literal solar years in the sense we understand that term, but rather represented something else entirely, perhaps dynastic periods during which multiple rulers governed under a single throne name, perhaps astronomical cycles encoded in human-scale narrative, perhaps sacred numbers associated with cosmic order and divine blessing, or perhaps simply mythological inflation designed to distinguish the primordial period from the merely ancient historical period that follows. The work of scholars like Thorkild Jacobsen, who produced the standard translation of the Sumerian king list in 1939, approached the text with meticulous philological care, noting the variations between different manuscript copies, the scribal conventions governing number notation, and the literary traditions that shaped how such documents were composed, all of which suggests that we cannot simply read these numbers the way we would read a modern chronological record, because the assumptions underlying ancient Mesopotamian record-keeping differed from our own in ways we are still working to understand. The numerical system used by the Sumerians was sexagesimal, based on 60 rather than 10, which is why we still have 60 seconds in a minute, and 60 minutes in an hour, and 360 degrees in a circle, all inherited from Mesopotamian mathematics, and some scholars have proposed that the conversion between sexagesimal and decimal notation may account for apparent inflation in the reign lengths, though no one has convincingly demonstrated how such a conversion error would work across the consistent pattern we observe in the antediluvian lists. Others have suggested that the unit of time translated as years may have referred to something else entirely, perhaps lunar months, which would reduce the reign lengths by a factor of 12, or even days, which would bring them into the range of normal human lifespans, though this interpretation requires assuming that later scribes fundamentally misunderstood the chronological system they were copying, which seems unlikely given the otherwise high quality of ancient Mesopotamian mathematical and astronomical knowledge, and besides, even dividing by 12 still leaves kings reigning for thousands of years, which is an improvement but hardly a solution. The quirky interpretation I want to explore in this section comes from the work of scholars who have attempted to find astronomical correspondences in the king list numbers, noting that many of the reign lengths are multiples of significant celestial periods. The 600-year SAR corresponds roughly to the precessional cycle divided by 72, while various other numbers align with planetary conjunctions and eclipse cycles, suggesting that the king list may encode sophisticated astronomical knowledge in narrative form, a kind of cosmic calendar disguised as political history, which would make the antediluvian kings not individuals at all but personifications of celestial eras, markers in a grand astronomical scheme that the Sumerians were tracking with remarkable precision. This interpretation has the advantage of taking Sumerian astronomical sophistication seriously, and we know from cuneiform texts that Mesopotamian skywatchers achieved impressive accuracy in predicting eclipses and planetary positions, while avoiding the necessity of proposing literal superhuman lifespans, though it raises its own questions about why such information would be encoded in king list format rather than astronomical tables, and whether we are perhaps reading patterns into random numbers the way people find faces in clouds and meaning in coincidence. The scholarly debate that particularly interests me concerns the relationship between the antediluvian and post-diluvian sections of the king list, because after the flood, the reign lengths dropped dramatically. The first post-diluvian king, Jushur of Kish, reigned for only 1,200 years, which is still impossibly long, but represents a 95% reduction from the antediluvian average, and subsequent reigns continue to decline until we reach historically plausible lengths of a few decades each, suggesting either that the flood marked some kind of transition in how time was measured, or that the divine and mythological gave way progressively to the human and historical, or that the scribes were interpolating between pure mythology and genuine historical records, and did their best to smooth the transition in a way that made narrative sense, even if it makes no chronological sense. Lambert argued that this declining pattern was evidence of later editorial intervention, scribes recognizing that the join between mythological and historical sections was awkward and attempting to create a gradual rather than abrupt transition, while others like Piotr Steinkeller have suggested that the declining numbers preserve genuine oral tradition, with the numbers becoming more accurate as they approach periods within reach of cultural memory, the way a family genealogy might extend back into legendary ancestors before eventually reaching great-grandparents whose lives are attested by living memory. The question of how to interpret these ages matters not just as an academic puzzle, but as a window into ancient Sumerian thought, because how we understand their relationship to truth, history, and narrative shapes our broader understanding of what these people believed about themselves and their place in the cosmos, and whether we conclude that they were engaged in political propaganda, astronomical encoding, religious symbolism, or genuine attempts to record remembered history, we learn something important about the varieties of human relationship to the past. For the ancient astronaut theorists, of course, the declining reign lengths tell a different story entirely. They suggest that the original Anunnaki rulers were gradually replaced by hybrid descendants with shorter lifespans, the result of interbreeding between the long-lived alien visitors and their human creations, a process of genetic dilution that eventually produced kings with normal human lifespans, who nevertheless retained some portion of divine heritage, explaining both the extraordinary abilities attributed to ancient rulers and the eventual appearance of fully human monarchs who lived and died on normal timescales. This interpretation, whatever its scientific merit, has the virtue of taking the numbers at face value and attempting to construct a coherent narrative that explains their pattern, and there is something intellectually honest about that approach, even if its conclusions venture far beyond what the evidence can support, because at least it grapples with the strangeness of the texts, rather than dismissing that strangeness as mere mythology not worthy of serious consideration. As your breathing deepens, and your thoughts begin to scatter like stars across the comfortable darkness of approaching sleep, consider that we may never definitively solve the puzzle of the Sumerian ages, that these numbers may remain permanently ambiguous, interpretable in multiple ways depending on the frameworks we bring to them, and that this ambiguity is perhaps itself the most honest relationship we can have with the distant past, acknowledging both what we can know through careful scholarship and what remains beyond our reach, lost in the gap between ancient minds and modern understanding. The temple scribes who first pressed these numbers into clay are dust now, their intentions inaccessible, their understanding of time and history and cosmic order fundamentally different from our own, despite the surface similarities of human experience, and when we read their words, we are always translating, not just language but worldview, trying to bridge a gap that 5,000 years of human development has only widened, and perhaps the best we can do is hold the mystery gently, appreciating its strangeness without forcing premature resolution, letting the questions linger like the last light of sunset fading slowly from a Mesopotamian sky. The king list continues after the flood, tracing dynasties through historical periods that archaeology can increasingly verify, and the transition from myth to history is never clean, never complete, the divine origins remaining present as backdrop and justification for contemporary political arrangements. Because even when the ages become plausible, the fundamental claim remains: kingship descended from heaven, authority derives from the gods, and every human ruler governs by divine mandate, an idea that would echo through Mesopotamian civilization for 3,000 years and beyond, influencing concepts of legitimate rule that still shape political thought today, though we have largely forgotten where these ideas came from, just as we have forgotten so much else about the people who first pressed words into clay and gave humanity its earliest written records. And so we come to the end of our journey through the oldest ages ever recorded, those impossible spans of time that the Sumerian scribes pressed into clay 5,000 years ago. And as the familiar comfort of approaching sleep wraps around you, let us rest for a moment in the mystery, rather than grasping for resolution, because some questions are better held than answered, better dreamed upon than solved. The Sumerian king list remains one of the most extraordinary documents from the ancient world, a text that casually claims to trace human governance back to the moment when kingship first descended from heaven, back through kings who reigned for tens of thousands of years, back through the great flood that divides mythic from historical time, and forward into periods that archaeology can increasingly verify, creating a continuous chain of human authority that stretches from the divine to the mundane without ever clearly marking where one becomes the other. What are we to make of these impossible ages, these rulers who outlived civilizations, these numbers that mock our assumptions about human lifespan and historical plausibility? Perhaps they encoded astronomical knowledge in narrative form, celestial cycles disguised as political history for reasons we can no longer recover. Perhaps they represented dynastic periods rather than individual reigns, compressed genealogies that later generations mistook for literal biography. Perhaps they were simply mythological inflation, the ancient equivalent of once upon a time in a kingdom far, far away, signals to listeners that they were entering sacred narrative space where normal rules did not apply. Perhaps, as the fringe theorists suggest, they preserve memory of contact with beings whose relationship to time differed fundamentally from our own, though we would need evidence far stronger than intriguing texts to take that possibility seriously. The beautiful truth is that we do not know, may never know, and that uncertainty invites us to keep wondering, keep questioning, keep returning to these ancient words with fresh eyes and open minds. The Anunnaki have faded now into history and mythology, those divine beings who supposedly descended from heaven to establish civilization, whether we understand them as personified natural forces, psychological projections, cultural memories, or something stranger still. The great temples they inhabited have crumbled to mounds of mud brick, scattered across the Iraqi landscape, excavated and catalogued and protected to varying degrees against the ongoing pressures of war, development, and time itself. The language in which their stories were first told has no native speakers, kept alive only in universities and museums by scholars who have dedicated their lives to understanding these fragments of the distant past. And yet something remains, passed down through 5 millennia of human culture, ideas and images and questions that continue to resonate even now, as you lie in comfortable darkness waiting for sleep to claim you. The very concept of kingship descending from heaven shaped political thought throughout the ancient Mediterranean and beyond, influencing notions of divine right and legitimate authority that persist in various forms to this day, though we have largely forgotten the Sumerian origins of these ideas. The flood narrative that closes the antediluvian age passed from Sumerian to Akkadian to Babylonian to Hebrew tradition, eventually becoming one of the most famous stories in human history, a tale of divine judgment and mercy that has been retold in countless forms across cultures and centuries. The mathematical and astronomical knowledge that may be encoded in those strange rain lengths contributed to traditions of celestial observation that influenced Greek, Arabic, and eventually European science. The 60-second minute and 60-minute hour, small daily reminders of Mesopotamian genius. If you enjoyed this journey through the oldest ages ever described, I hope you will consider subscribing, not because the algorithm demands it, but because these quiet explorations of ancient mystery are better shared with a community of curious minds, willing to let wonder take precedence over certainty. The night has grown deep now, and your body knows what your mind sometimes forgets, that sleep is not a cessation, but a continuation, a different mode of being, where the boundaries between past and present, between the ancient and the contemporary, grow soft and permeable, where a temple archive in old Eridu might feel as close as your own bedroom, and the scratch of reed on clay might sound like rain on your window. Let the impossible ages drift over you now like clouds across a moonlit sky. Let the names of forgotten kings become a gentle mantra, Alulim, Alalgar, Enmenluana, and let the great span of human history, with all its strangeness and beauty and unresolved mystery, carry you gently towards sleep. The Sumerians believed that dreams came from the gods, messages from the divine realm where the Anunnaki still held court, and perhaps tonight you will dream of ziggurats rising from marshlands, of scribes pressing words into clay, of ages so vast they contain all of human experience and still leave room for wonder. Good night, and may your sleep be as deep and peaceful as the Abzu, those sweet waters beneath the earth, from which all life springs, and to which all life returns. End of script. Sweet dreams.